Today on Jacked Up Politics, we're talking with Hugh O'Connell, the political editor for the Sunday Times. We'll be talking to Hugh about Eamon Ryan's resignation, the results of the European and local elections, and what this has in store for the government over the next couple of months. All this and more on today's episode of Jacked Up Politics. So we're very pleased to have Hugh O'Connell, little editor for the Sunday Times, on the podcast with us today. Hugh, you're very welcome.
Thanks very much for having me.
So Hugh, this is going to be a tiny bit of a discussion about kind of yesterday's events with Eamon Ryan resigning as leader of the Green Party, and and just about your journey in political journalism, because I know we're kind of like you are very involved in kind of like print media, and we're kind of very involved with digital media, you know. And I think it was a very good idea to kind of get to meet up with you on the podcast here today and kind of just explore how both kind of branches of media, both written and digital media, are having an impact on the general public's political decision.
Yeah, no, look, I'm delighted to be here and delighted to talk about some of that stuff. So I'll answer as well as I can any questions that you might have.
And that's perfect. So yesterday we saw that Eamon Ryan was stepping down as leader of the Green Party. And for anyone that knows, Eamon Ryan was a TD from 2002 up until 2011 when the Green Parties got washed out of government. And he was re-elected then in 2016 as a TD again and is now stepping down. It's been a bit of a roller coaster for Eamon Ryan.
Yeah, it has. I mean, it's quite extraordinary to think that he was leader of the Green Party for the last 13 years. And I mean, in that time, he has led a party that had no TDs and 2 councillors. And when he became leader, he wasn't even in any elected position, either locally or nationally in 2011. And he was really taking over a party that was in the doldrums after the 2011 wipeout of all of its TDs and senators. As that Fianna Fáil Green government was punished for the economic crisis and the bailout and all of that. So he has built the party really from the ground up to a situation where in 2014 he ran in the European elections and he came reasonably close to getting a seat in Dublin, but didn't. The Greens got a handful of councillors elected across the country. And then in 2016 was when the breakthrough started. He was elected to the Dáil in Dublin Bay South. And Catherine Martin, who's his deputy leader, who's also announced that she's standing down as a deputy leader of the party, she was elected in Dublin Rathdown. So incrementally, the Green Party built itself back up to really its breakthrough year in a big way was 2019, when the Green Party was one of the big success stories of the local elections, and they got close to 50 councillors elected across the country. Councillors elected with massive surpluses in some cases, particularly in South Dublin. And then in 2020, 12 TDs elected, a record for the Green Party, its best ever election. And it went into governments with Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, a historic grand coalition of the 2 old Civil War parties, bolstered by the Green Party. And they produced what has been widely viewed as the greenest program for government ever. And it is not green enough as far as some people in the Green Party are concerned. But it is no doubt that Eamon Ryan, over the last 4 years, has shepherded through some of the most significant legislation in the history of the state that sets the course for reducing carbon emissions quite substantially between now and the end of the decade, and most notably legally binding carbon emission reduction targets, which are set in law, set in stone, and which the government can be pursued through the courts for if they don't meet these targets. So he has really had a tangible impact on this government and on the Irish legislative and policy landscape over the last few years. I mean, even on a practical level, public transport fares have been reduced, local link bus services introduced across the country, more cycleways, more footpaths, less investment in roads, really sort of fundamental shifts in public policy in the transport space, and preparing the groundwork for greater use of offshore wind energy. All of these things will have seismic impact on Irish society for decades to come. So he's been very consequential, if not always popular, which we can discuss as well if you want.
Yeah. And I think, like, and I feel very bad for the Green Party personally, because they've achieved quite a lot in the 4 years that they've been in government. But I think it's always the case with Irish politics that it's always the smallest party in the coalition. If the government haven't been performing as well as the public have liked that, it's the smaller party will always take the battering, and it's never Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael that takes a massive battering. It's always a smaller one. And I think we've seen that in the recent or local election results and the European results. We saw that both Ciarán Cuff and Grace O'Sullivan, the two incumbent Green MEPs, lost their seats. And we also saw that they went from about roughly 50 seats in the local election in 2019 down to about 23 this time.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, certainly the overall vote share for each of the coalition parties, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the Greens, went down in this election. But the Greens took the most tangible hit when you look at the fact that they halved their local authority seats. They lost their 2 MEPs, whereas Fianna Fáil gained 2 MEPs. Fine Gael lost 1 MEP. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael both lost councillors, but not at the same level or not at the same rate that the Green Party did. So it was a very bruising election for the Green Party, and I think it was really a backlash against some of the policies which have been deeply unpopular with some voters, particularly in rural Ireland. I mean, if there's one thing that I've kind of picked up on over the last 24, 48 hours as Eamon Ryan has announced his decision to step down, which he said is not linked to the result last weekend. I mean, he said this has been a long time coming and he had thought about this for a while. And I think we have to take him at face value on that. But there's no doubt the narrative around it will obviously centre on the fact that they've had a poor election and he's stepping down. But I mean, one of the things that a lot of Green Party people are saying is that we have come under a concerted attack from elements of rural TDs in the Dáil who have consistently attacked the Green Party and its policies and demonised the Green Party and its policies. And I do think I'm not sure about that as a political strategy in terms of giving out about that. You have to just counter that narrative. You have to be better at getting your message across. And it's no use complaining about the fact that there's been some concerted campaign by rural TDs to have a go at you. If that is the case, I mean, that is the nature of politics. Sinn Féin spends a lot of time thinking about how to, mount coordinated attacks on the government and government policy, as do other opposition parties, and that includes, primarily Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. So if the Greens are coming under attack for their policies from rural independence, they just have to be better at countering them. I don't think giving out about them is going to achieve anything.
Definitely not. And I think what surprised a lot of people was in this local election campaign was the fact that Labour actually had a bit of a resurgence in the European campaign this year, that they actually got Aidan O'Riordan into the European Parliament, which was great to see for Labour. That many people for the last 8 years had thought Labour was actually on a decline after they were ousted in 2016, but it would appear that Labour are the underhorse and they're kind of coming back.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt. Excuse me. There's no doubt about it that the Labour Party had a good election. Getting an MEP elected in Dublin is a huge achievement for them. I think they were surprised themselves that they managed to achieve that. And that, I think, helped certain councillors get re-elected as well, or get elected. The kind of rising tide lifting all boats. People voting for Aidan O'Riordan, also voting for Labour in the local elections and for their local Labour candidate. So it was a good election for them. It's probably the first good election that Labour have had in quite some time. I mean, even if you go back to their historic election in 2011, it wasn't as good as they thought of in the run-up to that campaign, when there was a lot of talk about the possibility of Eamon Gilmore becoming Taoiseach because Labour could be the largest party. Obviously, that all fell by the wayside, but they were slightly disappointed that they didn't return more TDs in 2011. And then obviously since then, they've had a series of disastrous elections. 2014, they were walloped across the country at local authority level, lost all of their MEPs. 2016, they lost 30 seats. 20, 2020 didn't have a great election. 2019 local elections didn't really have a great election there either. Made no impact when it came to the European elections. So Labour has incrementally built itself back up. It is no doubt about it. It's a very small political force now at this stage, and it's kind of competing for space on the central left of Irish politics with the Social Democrats. But they've had a reasonably good election, and they can definitely be confident, I guess, heading into the next general election that they may be able to add a few more TDs into the door.
Definitely, and I think what surprised a lot of people was actually the fact that we had 3 TDs elected into Europe from this European election campaign, and that now puts the government in a very tricky situation, whereas they have 6 months from the time the individuals are elected from the 3 constituencies into Europe, and have 6 months thereafter to elect or have the by-election to have a candidate elected to replace those 3 TDs that are now going to be leaving Leinster House and heading for Europe. Do we think that the government will hold those 3 by-elections, Hugh, or do we think the government are going to push for an early snap election around October, November time?
It's a very good question. It's the question that most people prior to yesterday were asking around Leinster House. Now that's kind of competing in the same space as that. Who's going to be the next leader of the Green Party? But look, everyone has a theory. Everyone has a view. There's I think a majority of opinion within the coalition parties. Certainly, I kind of a backbench and even privately at a ministerial level, that it wouldn't be a good idea to run the by-elections, that the general election should take place before that the general election should take place before the end of the year. But the 3 coalition party leaders, Simon Harris, Micheál Martin, and the soon-to-depart Eamon Ryan, have made very clear they want this government to go the full term. And I think that, we have to take them at their word on that at this point. I think in truth, Simon Harris, whose constitutional prerogative it is to seek an election by asking the president to dissolve the Dáil, is probably uncertain at this point as to what to do and whether he should go early before the end of the year or wait it out until March of next year. But I do think that the events of the last few weeks had certainly made an election before the end of the year more likely. I don't think it'll be in October. I think the logistics of that don't stack up. Most people in government are working towards the budget being delivered on October the 8th. It's traditionally the second Tuesday in October, and that is October the 8th this year. So I think if that were the case, then you would have an election in somewhere in mid to late November. So that would be a more likely date, I think. And I do think, on the balance of probabilities, that's probably when the election will be, I should say. But certainly I wouldn't rule out the government going the full term to March next year. And I've always been of the view, right back to when this government came to office in June 2020, that they had a good chance of going the full term. And I think, it's a pretty stable government all told. It's lost 1 or 2 people over the last few years, but it's maintained its stability, and it's kind of bolstered in the door by the support of a number of independents, as we see in various confidence votes that have taken place over the last couple of years.
Yeah, so we're going to kind of turn away from the government side of things now, and we're kind of going to talk a tiny bit about the opposition parties, a small bit. That we saw that Sinn Féin actually picked up a number of seats in the local elections, but not as many as they were hoping.
Yeah, excuse me. Look, it was a very disappointing election for Sinn Féin. I don't think there's any doubt about that. They did increase their vote share on 2019. They did elect more councillors, I think 22 more councillors than they had going into the election. They got 2 MEPs, which was a doubling of their cohort of MEPs, which was just 1 in the road to this election. But when you consider the party had been polling at kind of 30+% over the for the majority of the last few years, it's a hugely disappointing election for the party. They had very high ambitions. They ran 335 candidates. They ran 6 candidates for European Parliament, 2 in each European Parliament constituency. They had very high hopes of getting far more people elected than got elected. And the post-mortem is underway in Sinn Féin over that now, and there's a lot of soul-searching as to what went wrong and why it went wrong and what the party can do next. I wouldn't rule out a comeback potentially on the scale of what happened in 2020, where 8 9 months after the local elections, they managed to turn it around and deliver their best ever result in a general election in the south. But it's a huge undertaking, it's a huge ask, and I do think that there are more fundamental questions facing Sinn Féin now than there were in 2020. Where are they just a party that kind of sits on the sidelines and cribs and moans about government policy and gives out relentlessly about government policy, is highly negative about government, is highly negative, and doesn't necessarily put to the fore its policy solutions or communicate them as well as they should in key areas like housing, obviously, which they've been very focused on over the last few years. I mean, there's a clear indication from this election that they need to change tack around that, and I'd be interested to see what they do in the months ahead.
Hmm. And we also saw the Social Democrats picked up quite a number of seats in this local election campaign, which I think is testament to the hard work of not just the Social Democrats volunteers, but I think volunteers in general, that you kind of saw that they went into this election with 22 seats, up 3 from their 2019 local election, came to 19 seats, and they ended up getting 35. So I think Holly Cairns can be very happy with that result.
Yeah, I look, I think it was a very encouraging election for the Social Democrats. I mean, particularly in Dublin, they had a very good election. They're the second largest party on Dublin City Council now, and you can see that they've made breakthroughs in certain parts of the country. They lost councillors in other parts of the country, and didn't make the breakthroughs perhaps they wanted to. European elections was very disappointing for them, I think. No real breakthrough candidates. They ran Sinead Gibney in Dublin. There was a lot of hype about her. She didn't even get her deposit back, because she didn't get a sufficient number of votes to come close to the quota. In Midlands Northwest, Rory Hearn didn't really feature, was eliminated very early on, and equally that's the case for their candidate in Ireland South, Susan Doyle. So a mixed bag, I would say, for the Social Democrats. And I would have gone into this election thinking that, given the hype around Holly Cairns, the change of leader, the new energy that should have put into the party, that they should really have been looking to overtake the Labour Party at local authority level and really sort of outpoll them, at least in the European Parliament elections. And there's very little indication that they did that. But look, they have a platform now, particularly at Dublin City Council level, from which to build. And obviously their leader, Holly Cairns, has announced that she's expecting, and that's fantastic news for her. First political party leader that I can recall, being pregnant while in office, and that's a great thing. And she'll take maternity leave, and she's kind of left the door open to coming back early if an election's called. But I think for her, she needs to obviously, go away, have her maternity leave, but come back and really kind of, put the floor to the mat in terms of getting the party G'd up for the general election and looking to make the sort of breakthrough that the Social Democrats should be looking to make at this point in their lifespan, where they're really getting a number of TDs elected. They're getting into double figures in terms of the number of TDs, and they're really challenging in that space that exists because of the collapse in support for Sinn Féin, that people are looking for an alternative, and the alternative, that they don't see that necessarily enthused by Sinn Féin. So perhaps they should look at the Social Democrats should be looking to target many of those voters who are turned off Sinn Féin at this point.
Yeah, and I think where the Social Democrats have picked up a small bit is on people who would not feel comfortable voting for Sinn Féin or, say, the Green Party anymore. I think that's where the Social Democrats kind of picked up a lot of votes, and I think that's kind of where they saw a lot of their success in the local elections. And I think that's a view held by many, that because of a certain degree of toxicity towards Sinn Féin and the Green Party may have contributed somewhat to the Social Democrats' success.
Yeah, I think so. The Social Democrats have the great advantage of never having been in government, so they're, in that sense, a bit less toxic than the Labour Party, who many voters still associate with that kind of terrible period of austerity between sort of 2011 and 2013, 2014. A lot of very difficult and damaging decisions taken by Labour in government at that point. And equally, Sinn Féin has that sort of residual toxicity because of its, frankly, its links to the IRA, its historic links to the IRA and the atrocities committed by the IRA in Northern Ireland, in the name of Irish republicanism, and that is a turn-off for voters. There's no doubt about that. Less so now than it would have been a few years ago. But Sinn Féin still obviously has difficulties in attracting votes because of that. And equally, I think Sinn Féin in this election had a difficulty attracting voters because they weren't necessarily convinced by the alternative being offered by Sinn Féin. So it's in that space really that the Social Democrats did capitalise to some extent in this election, but I think really should be looking to capitalise more. But look, there's no doubt for the Social Democrats, a huge victory for them, I think, is that in the kind of cockpit of the country, Dublin, in the city, they are the second largest party in local government, and they're ahead of Sinn Féin, and that would be a huge boost for them.
Mm. So we're going to kind of talk a little bit about your work with the Sunday Times as the political editor, and I imagine that that's a very difficult role, given how politically polarizing it is in Ireland at the moment. That like we've never seen politics being so polarizing in Ireland as we have seen in 2024. So what kind of changes have you seen, Hugh, over the last couple of years in terms of kind of the emergence of kind of anti-immigrant or anti-immigration parties and kind of anti-migration parties as well?
Yeah, I mean, look, I've been covering politics for well over a decade now at this stage, and that is a period in which there has been huge political change in Ireland. I mean, for a lot of people who preceded me in jobs like this, Ireland was a 2.5 party system. It was either Fianna Fáil in governments, sometimes with independents, sometimes with smaller parties, but very much the big beast in government, or it was a Fine Gael Labour alternative, and perhaps again with some other smaller parties. But since 2011, obviously, Fianna Fáil's historic collapse, the elevation of the Fine Gael Labour government, and then the splintering of that government because of austerity and other matters, and then this sort of Fine Gael independent minority government backed up by Fianna Fáil and the confidence to supply arrangements, to this now coalition of Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, this historic grand coalition of two parties who for decades swore they would never go into government together. So there's been a lot of change. There's been a lot of flux in politics. The rise of Sinn Féin, their historic general election result in 2020, becoming the third political force in Ireland alongside Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, the historic collapse of the Labour Party from which it's never really recovered since 2016. Although some green shoots in this election, the Green Party becoming a serious political force, although that's now at threat, now at risk. The rise of independence, the involvement of independents in governments between 2016 and 2020. So I suppose the point I'm trying to make is that there's always change and there's always volatility, or there has always been volatility, particularly over the last 10 years in Irish politics. And so into that space now has come the immigration debate, and has come the rise of, in some instances, far right, anti-immigration, frankly racist candidates and political parties, to those on the right who are just a little bit concerned about immigration, don't think the government's doing a good enough job, and believe that we should have a more restrictive immigration policy. So that's, it's a new political phenomenon in Ireland. And we saw in these elections that there has been some breakthrough for that kind of politics. Some far right-wing councillors elected to Dublin City Council. I think about half a dozen in total across the country. You see in the European elections, some very I would say, in some instances, dangerous candidates getting good votes, good chunk of first preference votes. We see someone like Niall Boylan in Dublin, who presents himself as kind of common sense, anti-immigration, anti-establishment. He did pretty well, didn't get elected, but was in the running for quite some considerable time. There was eliminated in one of the later counts. I think they will learn lessons from these elections, and they will, if they're smart, they will find a way to coordinate and coalesce around particular candidates in Dáil constituencies in the run-up to the general election, and that then could potentially lead to a breakthrough of a small number of TDs in certain constituencies across the country. But that's just the reality of politics down the years. There's always breakthroughs, by political forces advocating for particular policy positions. I mean, look in Donegal, for example, the 100% redress MICA candidates getting elected there to the local authority in Donegal. So I wouldn't overstate the rise of anti-immigration, far-right, anti-establishment candidates in this country. I wouldn't understate it either. But I think we have to look at it in the context of the great kind of wave of political change in this country over the last 10, 15 years and see it in that context. Whether it is a sufficient political force to upset the broad dynamic that exists, that, you know, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael still commands support of nearly half, perhaps even more than half of the population. We will wait and see whether they, you know, take that vote of Sinn Féin and sort of, you know, diminishes Sinn Féin as a political force in this country for the foreseeable. We have to wait and see, but I'm not necessarily convinced that they're going to make the massive breakthrough that some people are predicting. And I think these elections that we've just had show that their impact is you know, not negligible, but it's not massive either, you know.
And over the last kind of 4 years, we have seen that this government has actually probably been one of the most stable governments in recent Irish political history in terms of any scandals that hit it were relatively minor. And thanks to strong leadership from either Leo Varadkar or Simon Harris or Micheál Martin during that time, they were kind of able to steady the ship. And the next question for you, Hugh, is going to be, is there any story from the last 4 years that you think should have gotten a little bit more media coverage or any little bit more political coverage in the newspapers or in news media for that fashion?
That's a really good question, and you're really putting me on the spot in the sense that I can't think of one right now that comes to mind. So you've stumped me slightly. But just to go back to one of the points you made in terms of kind of scandal-free governments, I mean, there's been some significant controversies in this government that, you know, when I look at Leo Varadkar, for example, and the way in which he weathered, you know, the significant furore over the leaking of a confidential government document to a friend, and the Garda investigation into that, which ultimately decided not to pursue a prosecution against him. You know, that was a significant moment in this government that I think, you know, was downplayed, and there was a degree of sort of collegiality in government that ensured that he wasn't kind of, you know, his head was not sought by either Micheál Martin or Eamon Ryan. But that was a moment of acute danger for this government in terms of if the Gardaí had decided to pursue a prosecution against, if the Director of Public Prosecutions had decided to pursue Leo Varadkar over this matter through the courts, I mean, it would have been extremely damaging to the credibility of the coalition, to not just him, not just Fine Gael, but the credibility of the coalition. So, you know, but look, ultimately it turned out the way it did. Leo Varadkar emerged from that, and then obviously decided to step down in the run up to these elections that we just had. It you know, with a view to helping, you know, giving Fine Gael a better chance in these elections. And I think as we've seen in these elections, you know, the election of the new leader has to some degree helped Fine Gael at that point. But I mean, look, you know, there are always stories out there that are not given sufficient attention or coverage, and one of the things that's really been problematic for political journalism over the last few years is the huge number of people who are getting out of political journalism, and a lot of them are going, you know, as has been noted widely, particularly on social media, a lot of them have gone to work for the government, and this has sort of been seen as, you know, that basically political journalists exist in this country to, you know, not rock the boat too much, not upset the political classes, and hopefully land a job in governments. That's a very cynical and I think incorrect way of viewing political journalism in this country. There are lots of hugely talented political journalists who were very good at upsetting the political classes and very good at annoying people and pissing people off and causing trouble for political parties and holding politicians to account, most importantly. And they left because the terms and conditions in this industry are not good. They are not as good as they should be for the work that these people put in. And the reality facing journalism outlets across the country and across the world is that fewer people are willing to pay for good quality journalism, and fewer people are willing to invest in good quality journalism. And while that is the case, you will find it harder to attract people into this profession, and you will find it harder to keep them in this profession. And that is inevitably going to mean that stories that should be covered and should be given the attention and should be highlighted, and controversies that are not properly covered because there's just not the resources to cover them, they will go missed. They will not be covered, and that will ultimately be damaging in the long run to democracy.
And I think you made a very good point that the conditions for political journalists in Ireland aren't as good as they should be. And when we look at the likes of America, you have the likes of CNN, MSNBC, Fox, and they're able to pay their lads hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, if not millions of dollars a year, to present political programs. And sometimes in Ireland, political journalists even struggle to make ends meet.
Yeah. Excuse me. Sorry. They do. Yeah. But one of the reasons why some of the people that work for CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, so there's a couple of reasons why they're paid lots of money. The market's bigger; it's 350 million people. They have a massive audience. In some instances, a global audience, particularly around elections, presidential elections, all that kind of stuff. So that drives huge amounts of advertising and all of these things. So you're operating in a much bigger market, but media in America is much more polarized. People on CNN and MSNBC and Fox News are much more likely to express a view, whereas in this country we have a tradition of political correspondents, political journalists. They might have a view, they might do a piece of analysis where they side with a particular person, but they tend to cover the news in as objective a way as possible. Certainly, that's what I try to do. And that's kind of boring sometimes. It doesn't necessarily get the clicks and the hits that people would like. Which is why you have in some instances this kind of I wouldn't say disturbing, but troubling sort of phenomenon of journalists sort of expressing views and having political views and expressing them and not being afraid to express them and taking a particular line on certain issues. And sort of straying into the area of campaigning journalism, which I think in the political space is not good and is corrosive to the kind of thing that we aspire to do, which is ultimately to hold all politicians and all parties to the same standards and to hold them to account and to make them accountable because ultimately, look, they're accountable at the ballot box. But voters, deserve to know as much about these people and the decisions they make as possible and how and why they make these decisions, particularly those who work in governments. And that's the job of me and my colleagues, is to kind of shed light on that insofar as we can.
And I think as well, like we on this podcast, we often say to people, our job is to be politically ambiguous and to be as apolitical as humanly possible. Now, I know myself, sometimes I tend to kind of give the Social Democrats or Labour or Sinn Féin a bit of a bias in my own personal opinion. And I think we all have our own personal political biases, and I think they can kind of reflect different people's style of reporting or their styles of journalism. Like I know myself, like I'm kind of slightly biased towards them because I kind of agree with a lot of their policies. So I was just going to ask you, what kind of role do you think kind of personal political biases play in political journalism in Ireland in 2024? Hugh?
Well, if you're a good political journalist who's good at your job, you don't let your biases and your own personal opinions influence your work. It's not perfect, but I do think it's part of the job of being a journalist is to leave your own personal opinions and your own biases and your own views about the world at the door and go in and be professional. And that's what I tried to do. And as I said, it's not perfect. It's not achievable. Like everyone not everyone, or what am I trying to say? Everyone is fallible. Everyone has flaws. Professionally, personally, all of these things. But I think it's part of the job, as I see it, to leave your biases at the doors and to pursue people from all parties as equally as possible. So that's what I try and do. And that's what I think other political journalists should do as well. But yeah, that's up to them.
And I think kind of like you've been in this game for 10 plus years now. And I think kind of like if that's a long, long time to be in politics by any stretch of the imagination, because 10 years plus is the length of feudal terms, you know. So kind of like you've probably seen a lot of changes in kind of like attitudes towards government in those 10 years. So I imagine kind of what the opinion towards government in 2024 was a lot different than the attitude towards government in 2014.
Yes. I'm not sure if I necessarily understand your question, but I mean, I guess what I would say in 2014 is there was a huge amount of anger in the country, a greater level of anger, I think, than exists now. Now, I could have that wrong, but I mean, there was unemployment of around 10+% at that point. There was the imposition of water charges, for example, which is kind of the final straw for hundreds of thousands of voters across the country. And there was a real feeling that the implementation of austerity was having a horrendous effect on some of the most vulnerable people in society. When you think about some of the cuts that were made in social welfare, and there was all sorts of problems being created that would come to fruition later down the line. I'm thinking particularly around housing, the fact that really between 2011, before then, and 2016, there was very little housing being built in this country, and that's obviously created a situation where we have a massive deficit in terms of housing supply in this country, which is only really being addressed in the last few years, and probably not at the scale that it needs to be. So, now we have full employment in this country. The economy is growing reasonably well. We have come through to massively seismic shocks in terms of COVID and the war in Ukraine, which sends inflation soaring, and inflation has come down quite a bit now in the last year or two. So I think that absolutely there's still a lot of anger in the country. One of the things I think which is really corrosive in society right now is a whole generation of people, probably your age, some of them even my age, who are completely locked out of the housing market and will never have the capacity to own their own home. And I think that's going to store a problem that may come to fruition at some point in the future, and may kind of manifest itself in maybe a more radical politics, maybe a more volatile politics than even exists now. But as I said, I don't really feel that there's that level of anger in the country that existed 10 years ago, but I could be wrong.
And I think my final question for you today, Hugh, is going to be, where do you think, like in 5 years, we're obviously going to see a new government within the next 5 years. My final question to you today is, who do we think is going to be in that government? Do we think it's going to be a Fianna Fáil Sinn Féin coalition? Do we think is it going to be a Sinn Féin left-leaning coalition? Or what's your thoughts on who do you think is going to be the next kind of coalition in government? Because we know that Sinn Féin don't have enough support to get in by themselves as the main political party in government in the next election. We might have said that in 2022, start of 2023, but I just don't think that support is there. So if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, look, I think at this point, the most likely outcome of the next election is that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael get sufficient number of seats to get close to a majority in New Dáil, which would be 87, but still a good bit short. Therefore, they would need to look at a smaller party or a group of like-minded independents. And that's one of the things we haven't really spoken about today, is kind of the rise of independents, although they're a very diffuse and disparate group. All of whom come from kind of different political persuasions, but some of them are kind of aligned on kind of key issues that they could form a coalition and could then, or an alliance, and then could enter coalition with Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. I do think that's the most likely outcome at this point, but we'll wait and see. As I said earlier, don't rule out Sinn Féin sort of returning as a big political force. I think they'll still be well short of what they need to form a government without one of Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil. And the other thing I'd say, which I think is really important, is that campaigns matter, and campaigns can change the course of elections in ways which the likes of me and you could not predict a year or 6 months in advance, or even 3 months in advance. Once the campaign starts, if a particular political party gets a bit of momentum, as happened to Sinn Féin in 2020, then they can go in a direction that they might not have envisaged, or even they might not have predicted. So campaigns matter. The next general election campaign will have a huge influence on who emerges as the biggest party or parties, and what the shape of the next government will be. But as I said, I do think that the most likely outcome of the next election is Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael being returned with support from a smaller party or with support from a group of like-minded independents, or both, perhaps.
And Hugh, I just want to say thanks very much for taking the time out your very busy schedule to come on today. I know, being a political journalist, you're probably up the walls with a lot of media coverage regarding what happened with Eamon Ryan yesterday, probably what's going to be a very interesting next couple of months in Irish politics. So from all of us, thanks for coming on today.
That's okay. It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
It's been our pleasure. So, folks, this has been our interview with Hugh O'Connell, the political editor for the Sunday Times. We will be back to you next Tuesday with another episode. So until then, folks, thanks very much for tuning in. This is Jack signing off for Jacked Up Politics, and we'll catch you on the next one. Wicked games we play make me wanna lose my mind. Found solitude, knowing it'll be over soon. Ever need a boost, count on me for the 1-2. Trouble don't last when the tough get